What a delight to be here. And wow, Ralph has just re-inspired me, and I actually feel sort of trembly with excitement when I start to sort of feel the potential of real change. And I know there's lots of barriers, but like Ralph, I'm not a person prone to despair. And I'm probably the guy, you know, if the airplane was going down and both wings had come off, I'd be going, we can get out of this. There's a way. We'll reconfigure the airplane on the way down. So I try not to be Pollyanna-ish either, though, and I guess that's the engineer in me just saying, okay, here's this bundle of things we have as tools, here's this problem, how do we find a solution? So I'm going to talk specifically about the electricity grid and dive a little deeper. Ralph sort of set us up for it. I'm going to take a deeper dive in how it's really the foundation of getting to a zero carbon economy. And it would be great if we'd all stop driving cars. It would be great if we all lived in smaller houses. But I'm not really thinking that's going to happen in the time frame that we have to solve this problem. So I'm very much on the path of, you know, yes, efficiency, yes, conservation, for sure. We need to do more of that. But I also don't think we're probably going to be ready for some huge and fundamental change in our consumption and our behavior. A lot of us like living rurally. We probably want to continue living rurally. We need something with four wheels quite often. And as we get older, we need it even more. So here we go. There we are. I have a website called carbontakedown.com. This presentation's already there. And I give a lot of talks on electric vehicles too, so there's all sorts of stuff on electric vehicles, and I'll try to make sure there's enough time for questions. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly so that we do have time for questions, and yeah, we'll just go from there. So what do I want to accomplish today? Just want to show you folks that a zero carbon economy is definitely within the sort of financial and technical possibilities for Ontario and many other places in the world, of course. So just like Ralph, you know, I always have this sort of feeling, almost every day I get it, that we live in this finite space. And I like this slide because it shows the thickness of the atmosphere. That's about 50 kilometers. I mean, that's it. It's not much air after you get up 50 kilometers. So drive from here to a little south of Westport, you're in outer space. And we're dumping 30 billion tons a year of CO2 into the atmosphere. And it doesn't really have anywhere to go. Because, yeah, there's no edge, as Ralph said. So it's just building up and up. It's like lighting your wood stove, getting it going as hard as you can get it going, and then adding more and more insulation to your house every day. And does it get warmer? Yeah, it's going to get warmer. That's what we're doing. It's pretty simple thermodynamically, hard to model precisely. So it means we have to stop using fossil fuels. It's not just like going down 50%. We have to go to near zero in the next 20, call it 30, in that range. We have to go to zero, or the consequences will be unbearable. Can it be done through burying all the carbon underground? No, that's just not turning out to be a good solution. Some of it, maybe, we'll pump it into the ground, do something with it, but it's certainly not sustainable for the long term. So we just have to stop burning fossil fuels. And so that's the fundamental driver of going to electricity. So there's a little terminology. Ralph mentioned some things, greenhouse gas. Most of you probably know that. We usually talk about it in tons, so 1,000 kilograms of greenhouse gas, 1 ton. It's usually called equivalent because there are some other gases, methane and a few others, but we'll just use tons for now. And then when you're talking about societal stuff, you talk about megatons, millions of tons. And in Ontario, we produce about 150, roughly, million tons per year. About 10, 11, 12 tons per capita, depending what year. And then this is maybe a new one to some of you. Terawatt hours is how, when you talk at a grid scale about electricity, how you talk about how much electricity you're using. So it's 1,000 gigawatt hours, a million megawatt hours, or more simply, think of it as about $150 million of electricity at the retail level. And we use about I think last year was like 137 terawatt hours in Ontario. So how much electricity will we require? Well, you have to take all the stuff we currently do and figure out what it's going to take to replace that activity with electricity. Like Ralph was saying, we don't want the barrel of oil. What we want is the heat for our house or the distance it'll take our car. So if you look at the pie chart for emissions in Ontario, it looks like this. These are very rigorously developed numbers that go to the federal government and they submit them to the UN. So it's pretty good. It's the best we have of what our emission profile is. And the most recent numbers, it takes a few years to generate them, are from 2021. So here we have residential and commercial heat. Most of that's natural gas emissions, 32 million tons. Other stationary combustion, so this would be just for creating heat or process energy, 22 million. There's aviation. It gets a little complicated because planes fly across the border of Ontario, so where did they refuel and all that stuff? Not going to worry about that too much. This is a big one. Vehicles, light-duty vehicles, vans and SUVs, transport trucks, rail and marine, you can actually see is pretty small. Off-road mining, agriculture, forestry. These are all basically piston engines. So gasoline and diesel engines. So we have to find substitutes for all of those motive powers. Then there's a bunch like fugitive methane. Well, that's mostly because we move a lot of natural gas around the province. If we don't use natural gas, then we wouldn't have those methane leaks. We got cement kilns that need high temperatures, iron and steel production using lots of coal. And then we have production of non-energy fuels. So this would be if we're making acetone or Varsol or paint or something. There's a good chunk of emissions associated with that, probably mostly in Sarnia, I would guess. I don't have. And then we've got agriculture. So all of these sources of emissions represent energy use. And all of that energy use, ultimately, by 2050, whatever we want to plus or minus a few years, we've got to substitute them with non-carbon emitting sources of energy. So how do we get that sort of wrestled to the ground? Well, today I'm just going to talk mainly about our heating, and Ralph mentioned heat pumps. I'm going to talk about transportation, because that's obviously electrification at some level, and stationary combustion, because a lot of that is process heat. That could potentially be electricity and heat pumps as well. You may have some questions about hydrogen. I'll save those for when we get to question period. So these are the things that we consider easily imagine technically electrifying. And then the question is, well, how much electricity do we need? And the intuitive feeling is that it's monstrous. But as Ralph mentioned earlier, it's actually not as much as you might imagine, and it's probably well within a doubling of the current grid. Doubling the current grid also sounds, oh my God, but we've doubled it several times in the last 100 years, many times in fact. In World War I, we doubled the grid in 4 years in Ontario. And in the 1970s with nuclear, we doubled it. I'm not a big fan of nuclear for reasons I'll get into, sustainability being one of them. But let's look at what it would take to do that. So the questions are, what do we electrify first? What's most economical to electrify first? Obviously, vehicles are already going that way. It's happening now. Heat pumps are happening. There's been some incentive programs, but they're not massive. How many additional How many terawatt hours are we going to need? So we want to figure out what's the amount of electricity we need to substitute those energy needs. Electricity generation, wind, solar, biofuels, nuclear, hydro. I probably missed something, but those are some of the options. What's it going to cost? Matters for sure. But whenever I get to cost, I always think we must eliminate fossil fuels. That's the direction we're going. It costs what it costs. We need to choose the most economical path, but it costs what it costs. Sometimes it might be a bit more. Sometimes it's actually a lot less. And as Ralph showed, generally all the analysis we do going out to 2050 shows that as an economy level, we're actually going to save a massive amount of money. Fossil fuel industry may not be too happy about that, but as consumers, we should actually support this in terms of our own pocketbooks and especially environmentally. What are the impacts? Well, if we put a whole bunch of wind turbines and solar farms up, this is going to be an impact. It's going to take some land and materials. So there are impacts to doing these things. But again, keep that reference point. We must eliminate fossil fuels. There's no option there, in my mind, at this point. And I'll just mention a little bit. Ralph mentioned the ISO, the Independent Electricity System Operator. That's the body in Ontario with a board of governors appointed by the government who manages the direction our electricity system is going in at the provincial scale. And they are key to figuring out where we're going in terms of 2050 and how we're going to get there. They've recently produced a report in March. It's actually, if you're really interested in this direction, it's really worth reading. It's probably the best take that they've had yet on how we're going to get there. Even a couple of years ago, they were saying, oh, there's going to be brownouts, we won't be able to do it. And now actually they have this report that projects out to 2050 what one of the possible paths is. It's not a scenario analysis in terms of looking at multiple paths. They look at just one particular scenario, and I think in that way the ISO is going to have to do a lot more work, but it's a good reference point to talk about. So Ralph mentioned as well, but efficiency matters. So that electric car doesn't need nearly the same amount of energy as the gasoline car, and we'll get to that in a minute. We spend collectively about $33 billion a year on gasoline in Ontario. So if we convert these vehicles to electricity, we'll be spending a fraction of that. So there's a huge economic potential. And of that $33 billion of gasoline and diesel we buy, 80% goes out your tailpipe as heat, 30% goes out the tailpipe as heat, about 30% out your radiator, and another sort of leaves 20% for just general heat loss. But most of it goes as heat. Only about 20% actually moves the car. And that's the part we can replace with electricity. So this is just a quick example. Here's your gasoline pump. You're going to put it into the engine. Gasoline engines, theoretically, they have efficiencies of in the low 30s. But practically, if you start your car on a cold day, drive 5 kilometers, buy that quart of milk, hopefully you buy more than one thing if you've driven 5 kilometers, but whatever, and drive home, your car probably ran at about 5% efficiency because it's heating up 250 kilograms of metal in the engine, which you then let cool off later. But round trip, sort of 15 to 20%. And an electric car, the efficiencies of the battery and the motor are more like 90+%, and about 13% goes off as waste heat. So that trip in the car, if you go up, let's say 100 kilometers, would take about 60 to 100 kilowatt hours of gasoline energy. I'm expressing it as a term you might associate with electricity, but it's an amount of energy, a kilowatt hour. And in the electric car, it takes about 20. So about a fifth to a quarter, depending on the exact usage. These are solid numbers. You can find lots of reference points for that. So we need way less electrical energy to move all the cars around than we needed fossil fuel energy. So that's one big reduction. When we look at that pie, those millions of tons of emissions from the fossil fuels, we actually need far less energy when we go to electricity. And we see that through various parts of the economy. So if we look at the, if we look at the electric vehicles, we're only going to need 20% of the energy we used to need in terms of fossil fuel. If we look at heating systems, it's really heat pumps are the only way we're going to do this. Yes, we should, have higher standards for the building code, but there's an optimal point of insulation and renovation versus putting in a heat pump. And so, moving forward, we're going to need more programs for energy auditing of homes and then find the sweet spots for heat pumps. And many people will be asking, well, what about those really, really cold days? Yes, there are a few hours a year where your standard heat pump may not heat your home. We need ways of dealing with that. But again, remember, it's no more fossil fuels. So we just have to find ways to manage those particular circumstances, whether it's a bit of heat storage or some pure electrical backup and a grid that can handle the peaks. Those are the kind of technical, detailed questions we need to answer. But heat pumps are clearly what's happening worldwide. There's massive growth in heat pumps. Europe, with its milder climate, it's just standard for heat pumps. The UK has been standard for heat pumps for 20 years now in a lot of cases. And heat pump technology is evolving too. So there are new heat pumps. Right now they use HFCs, which are actually a greenhouse gas, fairly potent greenhouse gas. But there are heat pumps that are being developed, and they're actually available in Japan and some other places that use CO2. They actually use the greenhouse gas, CO2, as the refrigerant. But they operate at much higher pressures, and there's a time lag to get that into the mainstream commercial market. So we can basically say, though, existing heat pumps are going to be 200 to 300%. Again, all that slice of megatons for heating buildings, the energy it represents, is much, much less when we go to electricity. So we don't need to replace the energy one for one. Depending on how good our heat pumps are, it could be 1 to 2 or even 1 to 3 that we're getting advantage. There's a ton of industrial processes in that pie chart, not just the making of solvents and paints, but steel making and all sorts of processes. Those basically have to be looked at individually for what technology is going to be appropriate to replace the fossil fuel heating, which would typically be natural gas in Ontario, but there's still some oil and coal used in various processes. We've got 25 years to get to that zero fossil fuel point. So let's do the stuff, as fast as we can that we know how to do. Electric cars, heat pumps in homes. We've got a few years to work on the trickier things, but we need to get moving quickly on the big items, which are transportation and heating. So when we do that conversion, what we find is that we need 30 terawatt hours to replace all the transportation. We can calculate that fairly easily because we just look at how much diesel and oil we use, diesel and gasoline, and then we just say, okay, if we use that 4 times more efficiently, that's the number of terawatt hours. And you might remember the province is using like 130, 140 terawatt hours a year. So it's a very doable number. It's not an outrageous number, literally to electrify all the transport in Ontario. And we'll also save tens of billions on purchasing fossil fuels. There's obviously a capital cost to doing that, and Ralph talked about that. We're always afraid of capital costs, but if you're saving $20 billion a year on fossil fuel expenditures, that frees up a lot of potential capital. If we convert the combustion energy, which isn't converted at as high in efficiency, so because we're using these combustion processes, not all of them can have heat pumps. So it's probably more like 40 to 60 terawatt hours. Could be less with new technology development. I haven't assumed massive technology leaps, and the ISO hasn't either in their work, and I'll show you some of their numbers in a minute. And for the home heating, again, because the heat pumps don't create quite the same leverage as electric vehicles, somewhere in this range. But if we also have an energy conservation program and we improve the efficiency of our houses, then that number decreases as well. So these numbers aren't fixed in any sort of 20-year time frame. But they're not outrageous either in terms of what the grid is and what it can eventually be. So that would create a 70% reduction in greenhouse gases. And again, 2050 is the target, zero fossil fuels is the target. It means that if we had programs that when your furnace conks out and your air conditioner conks out, you move to a heat pump, we can wait till those furnaces, all the furnaces are going to conk out by 2050. How many people here have a 30-year-old furnace? Not a lot of us, right? They don't last that long. So we can stage these kind of developments so that the technologies can be implemented over time. We might have to push them in some cases. So somewhere in this range, Ralph would probably go for a lower number. When I do the numbers, I get a number similar to what the ISO has done. And I think I maybe showed this 3 years ago when I talked to the group. Some of these numbers are very similar now. If we look at the Ontario grid, this is the number, this is the same curve Ralph showed. It's actually been about flat for the last 10 years. This is what's been saved through energy conservation. This is what has been saved through embedded generation. So that can be solar in the case of on your home or on a business. Or it could potentially be natural gas making electricity at a commercial facility. Like Queen's University has a natural gas turbine that makes electricity that they deliver to the campus. But what's critical here is that the demand has actually been fairly flat because of conservation and because of efficiency improvements. If we look at what the ISO says we need out to 2050, it looks like this. So this is the residential sector, and they're assuming a certain amount of heat pump adoption, which takes it from 2025, here's today, to 2050, takes it up, I can't remember exactly, like 25% more. I'll talk to that a little bit. This is the commercial sector. This is the industrial sector. They assume actually a 40% increase there if you look at the gray. And this is transportation, this big slice here. So going from almost zero now, we've got like 200,000 electric vehicles in Ontario right now. And the ISO assumption in 2050 is we have 11.5 million. Basically all transportation vehicles are electric by 2050. The ISO is in a tricky spot when they do this because they are commanded by the provincial government maybe to look at going to low carbon, but they can't say all houses will be converted to heat pumps because they don't have control of that. And the province doesn't have a program to do it, and the federal government hasn't mandated we'll go to 100% heat pumps. So the ISO sort of fudges that a little bit, like, well, it'll be quite a few heat pumps, but maybe not all. And on something like electric vehicles, though, they can assume 100% because the federal government says by 2035 will be 100%. So 15 years after that, basically all vehicles are electric. So that's where the provincial government has to step up to the plate and say, we're going to zero, and here's the way we're going to do it. And then the ISO can model that more in line with government policy. In any event, what this means is about 80 or 90 terawatt hours more of generation by 2050 would meet the electrification that the ISO sees. If you dive a little deeper, they aren't necessarily going to a zero carbon province. They're predicting what they see under existing legislation and existing trends, but they don't have a mandate to go to zero carbon. They need one, but only the provincial government can mandate that. There are electricity zero carbon goals that the federal government is setting, but of course some provinces are pushing back. If we look at production in terawatt hours over time, we see in 1970 for Ontario, we were using, let's call it 60, and then this is the nuclear build-out years. We doubled our terawatt hours of generation during the nuclear build-out years, and you all remember the hydro ads encouraging us all to get electric furnaces. You remember the ad with the furnaces like a big growling monster? And it's like, oh, I want you to put, anyway, you did the video. And then we had this long period where basically demand has been pretty flat, which actually means on a per capita basis, it's gone down substantially. So that's due to efficiency and demand management and all sorts of other practices. But it's really quite amazing that for 30 years, our terawatt hours consumption has basically been flat. And then if you look at adding 3 million electric vehicles, it would add about 10 terawatt hours. So a lot of people fear EVs are going to flatten the grid. Well, 10 terawatt hours is a lot of electricity, but it's not a killer amount of electricity, especially if we use it at night, when often we have to dump electricity to other parts of North America. But then if you look to that 2050 level, then you see it does get more significant, and whether it's a 50% increase or whether it's a 70% increase, it's probably somewhere in this window of 220 to 250 or more terawatt hours. So that's sort of where we're headed. We need to do more work to nail this down. The ISO needs better direction from the government, but this is certainly, we're heading in that direction. We're not going to remain flat as we electrify all transport and all heating and all commercial processes. So when we're looking at growth like that, we want to think, well, how much land area do we need? What's it going to cost? How long is it going to take? I mean, building a solar farm doesn't take very long. Siting a wind farm can have a lot more opposition and may take longer. Building a new nuclear plant certainly takes a decade if it's on a greenfield site, possibly longer, and probably a decade even if it's on an existing site. I mean, most of our nuclear power will be near the end of its life by 2050. So between now and 2050, we have not only the new demands of EVs and electrifying heating, but we also have existing generation sources that end their life and so we need to replace them as well. So there's a cascading effect, and the ISO, to their credit, there's lots of documentation that shows the end of life of various existing generation sources, including wind turbines. They have a 20 to 30 year life. Maybe they can be extended a bit longer. But there's a continual renewal of the equipment that makes our grid operate. We need to get public approval. Well, ideally, we need to get public approval. I realize that doesn't always happen. And can it be done is sort of like, well, that's a lot of stuff to make. Where does it come from? Can we build it that fast? So we need to look at other historical technology trends to see, well, can we move this quickly? Most of us aren't used to thinking in hundreds of billions of dollars, so it takes some time to sort of get your head wrapped around. These are the kind of numbers that are involved in these societal shifts. So this is a neat graph which shows, and it's from a group called World in Data. And a particular person there, Hannah Ritchie, has been great in sharing this stuff with me. And this is a really neat one that she just did last week. And what it shows is, some of you might not be able to see, but all this gray stuff is nuclear electricity generation that was deployed in Japan, United States, Germany, Belgium, France. And then up here is solar in dark red and wind. And this is Netherlands, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, United States, China, France. She didn't show Canada, and I don't know what the number would be. It's probably not a lot different than the United States. And this is how many kilowatt hours were built per year per person in the country. So if you're making a transition to a higher level of electricity consumption and you're going to be building generation, these are the kind of numbers that you want to look at with, can it be done? And we see in the 1970s and early 80s, Sweden deployed 624 kilowatt hours per person per year of new nuclear capacity. So that was possible. It was done. Japan was a little lower. And these are the rates of solar and wind for the last 5 years to 2023. A lot of this data takes time to compile, so it's often a year or two out of date. Excuse me. And you can see the Netherlands is actually exceeding most countries' 1970s and 80s nuclear rollout in solar and wind deployment. Australia is a little ahead on solar. It's a little sunnier than the Netherlands. Sweden's big on wind. But these deployment rates are well within what the nuclear industry did. And they are actually real deployment rates being funded, commercially developed wind and solar systems. Yes, there's some intermittency, we'll get to that. So if we look at Ontario to 2050, and we talk about the grid growing by 80 to 100 terawatt hours to electrify all this stuff, what's it look like in Ontario? That's the line for Ontario. It's well within what's already happening in other countries in the world. It's certainly well within what we financed decades ago. So this tells me that it's very doable from a technology deployment level. Will we have the societal permission? Will the government go in this direction? You know, those are the big uncertainties. But there's nothing magical in terms of where we need to go. So if we look at where that generation would come from, here are the 3 main options. It won't be biofuels. It's too much biofuel to make this kind of electricity. There is no magic source of hydrogen. I'm not banking on fusion getting us there. It's still a long way out from everything I believe and read about fusion. So we can look at photovoltaics, new nuclear, and wind. And here are just some reference numbers. So if we did half of the 150 terawatts, let's say it was 150, and that includes making up for some of the sources that end of life was reached before 2050. So we're going to lose many thousands of megawatts of wind and nuclear, particularly in the next 25 years as they reach their end of life. If we assumed half of this new electricity came from photovoltaics, we need to put in what sounds like a huge number, 125,000 megawatts. It is a big number. And it would cover about 2,000 square kilometers. So it's a big chunk of land, but hold your hats for a minute because we'll get to that. It's about 0.2% of Ontario, costs around $160 billion. I've used commercial rates of actual solar farm deployment in this case, which has become very, very cheap compared to even a couple of years ago. If we built that 75 terawatt hours with new nuclear, we need about 20,000 megawatts. That's like 4 times Bruce generation. It would occupy about 69 square kilometers if you use existing nuclear plant sort of secure boundaries. And it would cost somewhere, if you use the new small modular reactor numbers that are being touted, we don't have it yet, but if it gets built and it's on budget, what are the odds? It would take 68 small modular reactors. So we're not going to use SMRs to make this electricity. That just doesn't make sense. So maybe you're going to use big nuclear. Current numbers for nuclear developed outside of China are, if we look at European numbers and what they've had in the US, it's $200 to $400 billion to build that new nuclear. And we've got waste. We still haven't disposed of any of our high-level waste. There's lots of activity trying to find a place for it, but none of it's been buried yet. It'll take almost 100 years just to bury it by the time you ship it there and you keep digging and you cast it in concrete and then stainless steel and then copper. There's a lot of cost for that. It's not sustainable. So the provincial government, believes we're going in this direction. I think the cost will be what ultimately slows and stops nuclear deployment. So I don't see it as the solution. We're probably going to build some stuff. It's cat's sort of out of the bag, but I think cost will, in the end, be a problem. Maybe the public will rally around the waste as being an unsustainable option. And then wind. So we've got lots of commercial wind already. We need another roughly 50,000 megawatts. It would probably occupy about 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometers of actual wind farm, big dimensions. The actual land area occupied by the bases of the turbines and the access roads would probably be around 30 square kilometers. And it's the cheapest, $100 billion. And some of you will be, well, but these things are intermittent. I never call renewables unreliable, because if the sun or the wind turns out to be unreliable, we're really in trouble. They are intermittent, which is very different. Very predictable on a longer scale, but intermittent at a shorter scale. So we can't obviously rely on these completely because it will be dark at night and there will be fewer windy days at certain times of the year. But if you look at these basic numbers, it's pretty clear that renewables offer a cost advantage if we can find a way to deal with the intermittency. And it's great that we have someone here talking about battery technology, because that's a huge part of how we deal with intermittency. So just for that horrifying number of 2,000 square kilometers for the photovoltaic fields, I'm suggesting we put it all here. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. I don't know who lives there, but they won't want it all there. But the GTA is 7,100 square kilometers, folks. And if we have to get to zero fossil fuels, I think we can probably find 2,000 square kilometers in this province that we could put PV on. Some of it could be on rooftops, but realistically, the most cost-effective thing is to use relatively flat land. Here's a number that puts it in perspective. That's how much forest burned last in 2021. So 8,000 square kilometers. That was a peak year, but each year in Ontario, it's 4-digit thousands of square kilometers that burn. So the PV is not insignificant, but I also think, again, we have to do that adjustment. We must use fossil fuels. What are the things we're willing to accept to get there? Once you take that position of we cannot use fossil fuels past a certain point, then these other things have to happen, or we go back to living in caves. So this is actual data of wind in Ontario for 8,760 hours in a year. And that's a very important number to learn if you're in renewable energy, because all the calculations are based on sort of hourly stuff. So this is actual wind in Ontario connected to the grid, not behind the meter at some place, peaking at about 4,000 megawatts. This is the summer. It's actually much less windier in the summer. It's pretty windy in the winter. And if we look at solar, I took the actual solar on the grid in Ontario. This is from the IESO data. And I just multiplied it by 10. So what if we had 10 times more solar, just for example? And here you can clearly see that in the summer, we have more solar energy, surprise, surprise. Here's a particularly nasty little part in November here where there's probably a week with very little solar energy. It's pretty nasty around before Christmas. That's when it's dark and gray and we're all getting a bit depressed. The winter's coming. Here's some more pretty dark gray periods in the winter. But you'll notice that every day there's a little bit of sun. And so it is pretty reliable. And on an annual basis, we can blend these together. And if you look at 10 times the wind and the existing, 10 times the solar and the existing wind, and you just combine them as output, this is what it looks like. So it actually starts to be much more flat over the course of the year. And this is where batteries come in. So each of these dips is potentially a loss of solar and wind energy that can be made up by storing the solar and wind when it's higher and then releasing that stored electricity when it's lower using battery banks. And that's what's happening in many, many grids around the world. And it's even happening in Ontario. The IESO, to their credit, is already deploying battery storage, and they actually have requests for proposals out for many, many more battery storage applications. Obviously, some communities are fearful of it. That will take time probably to mitigate some of that resistance. And they're also putting out RFPs for new wind and solar, what they call zero emissions generation, which other than nuclear, only wind and solar meet that requirement, for about 5,000 megawatts in the next, I think it's about 6 or 7 years. It's probably not quite enough we're going to have to go a little higher to get to the 2050 rate, but this is what's happening. And this is California as of early April. This is just it's one day from 12 a.m. to back again to midnight. And what they've done is averaged all of the April solar, wind, and other generation in California that's currently deployed. And you'll see this huge chunk of energy here in the middle. These are megawatts here, 20,000, which is similar to the Ontario grid, actually. You'll see this is their solar. They obviously have better solar than us. And this is what they're making up with batteries right now. So at the end of the day, when the sun goes down, this is wind. You can see wind is actually pretty constant. There's a little morning lag. But wind on average over the month of April is actually a pretty constant, 4,000 megawatts. And then solar ramps up incredibly. And then at the end of the day, when solar goes down, and you can see there's a peak here, that's typical for most grids. At the end of the day, everybody comes home. In California, their house is hot. They turn on their AC, they turn on the TV, they start cooking on their stove, and the load goes up. They plug in their electric cars in the future. And so batteries, in this case, take up a big chunk of that load in the evening. And this is just an early indication of where grids are going. And generally in this business, everybody sort of that's realistic about it knows grids are headed in this direction. If we look at what we're spending, and Ralph sort of introduced this, so I won't dwell on it too much. We probably spend just under $50 billion a year in Ontario on fossil fuels if you include natural gas. Ontario's GDP is about $800 billion. Annually, we spend $10 billion on cell phone subscriptions in Ontario. Darlington and Bruce refurbs are about $26 billion. The ISO has spent about $70 billion on grid development since 2003. And we would need to spend about $10 to $15 billion a year to implement this 150 terawatt hours of solar. Ralph might argue with my numbers a little bit, but I think we're in the same ballpark. And frankly, I didn't have 20 consultants at $100,000 each to get my numbers. But the ISO does have those people, and they can do this. They can create a scenario with much more accuracy, but I'm very confident that it is not a crazy expenditure. It's a decision we have to make, and then it will be very doable economically. Yes, there will be losers. The natural gas industry is going to lose on this. Fossil fuel industry is going to lose. So we know there's lots of pushback it's present now, and it will be there in the future too. Okay, conclusions, and we'll take some questions. We got to have a government that makes this a priority. That's one thing that we need. When we'll get that, that's going to depend on the voters. We need to eliminate natural gas electricity generation. Right now, we're heading to expand it. So we're going in the wrong direction at that type of generation. We need to support EVs and heat pumps. I know that's what a group like yours can do in a community like this. Education, awareness, programs, educating HVAC contractors, all of those things can be part of local community action. And I think we need to have a meaningful consultation with the province. We need a commission that goes out to communities and spells out the kind of information I've spelled out to you today and says, how do you want to do this, folks? What are your concerns? And spell out the fact that it's going to save us money, but we need to choose a path, and we need to have probably done it quite a long time ago, but we have to get on the boat at some point. We just have to move in this direction. So I think we need a major provincial commission. I've written that to the IESO. I haven't knocked on Doug Ford's door personally, but we certainly need some kind of broader discussion about doing this. And then probably we save like $40 billion a year on existing fossil fuels. So what can you do? Contact your MPP, tell them to get on the burner about this. Electric cars are a good solution. I can answer questions on that. Heat pumps, there's some challenges for sure in each house, but we're going in that direction. Hybrid electric hot water heaters are another option. They're out there. I've got one, and it costs me about 15 cents a day now for my hot water. It's so cheap. There are issues, but flying, don't fly if you don't have to. Wi-Fi based thermostats, I just pull out my phone and I can turn my heat up and down. That's nice when I'm traveling. Buy less of everything except for EVs and heat pumps. Okay, thank you very much. So I believe we've got a few minutes for questions. I think I started about a few minutes late, so hopefully we have at least 10 minutes. I think the idea is that folks come up to the microphone.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Jenna Bernica, and I have a cabin in Elgin, so in my Highlands, and I also live 10 blocks from Parliament. And I'm a climate reality leader, so I very much appreciate your presentation this morning. I am wondering though, you said we have 25 years, and that's 2050, but yet we know 2030 is another date that you're all looking at to reduce the heat that we have on this planet. And Ralph had mentioned, we've triggered the Earth's natural system. So my question is within this context, and possibly can share something about that. In Ontario, I thank you for letting us know, like that in the evening we're we use less electricity, but I understand we're also dumping electricity because we don't have storage. And when we buy to replace usage that we have at night because of non-electricity, we're actually buying from places where that electricity is pretty dirty, like coal. Can you give us a sense of what's really happening within a non-availability of storage? Because Ontario, we have all kinds of electricity, but at night, things are happening, and we're actually using some electricity to combine places. That's not great.
So I'm going to answer a little bit, and then I'm going to pass it on to Ralph. Is Ralph still here? Oh, there, yeah, because I know Ralph will be able to provide more precise numbers in this. So maybe Ralph, if you want to come up already, if that's okay. At night, yes, nuclear reactors are very difficult to turn down their output. Just the physics of the reaction is such that you can't ramp them up and down like the throttle in your car. So at night, we got to keep those reactors humming along. And there's other contractual reasons that natural gas plants run sometimes even at night, even though we don't need the electricity. We sell that to the US generally. In terms of how much we actually buy back into Ontario, I think, Ralph, you maybe know much better. I'm not going to make a guess at that. So maybe if you could speak to what we import into Ontario.
Don't know. I know it's the net amount of power is fairly small compared to the size of our system. We're not a big net exporter of electricity, but there is this thing called wheeling where utilities cooperate across the border so that when we've got, especially nuclear is a problem because you don't want to shut it down. It takes too long to start it back up again, so they'll dump that into the States for next to nothing. Or apparently there's even been times when they've paid them to take it, which has occurred to me from time to time as well. But
so storage, right? It's the ability to actually store something so that we can manage these ebbs and flows in the middle of it.
Yeah, go ahead, expound on storage. Storage, is storage the solution, I guess? Maybe you can comment on that.
For what we have, although I'm not a nuclear advocate either, so I think we can
yeah, storage is going to be, I think Steve made the point, it's going to be really, really important in the system that's coming, and it comes in all colors and different, depending on how long you can store it. So it's going to be extremely important to be able to flatten the heat pump peaks, which don't last very long, but they can be quite high as we move more buildings into them. And then there's longer term storage, which we have pumping water up at night using that power. There's a new one of those being built up around Georgian Bay.
Meaford.
Up around Meaford. And that's basically a nuclear storage battery. So they are doing this. Not a terribly popular, it's not universally popular up there what they're doing, but it's not too bad from when I looked at it. It doesn't have a huge footprint.
So area for innovation.
Beg your pardon?
An area for innovation, it looks like.
There's also, you haven't mentioned vehicle to grid.
No, we didn't talk about
electric vehicles would be quite different from gasoline vehicles in the sense that most people will just top it up every night. With our gas vehicles, we wait till the tank is over half empty and then we fill it up. The electric vehicle, you'll probably top it up after midnight. That'll be the long-term trend. And when you get home at the end of the day, you will only have used maybe 10 or 20 kilowatt hours of a 70 or 80 kilowatt hour battery. So that's available. And I think the electric vehicle, I think we're going to look back at electric vehicles and actually think that their most disruptive impact will not be the impact they had on transportation, but it's the introduction of millions of portable batteries. It's going to be very, very important in the future grid. When they're plugged in downtown Toronto, they will help Toronto Hydro with the problem it has when the air conditioning load peaks, because all the cars in the office building parking garage will be able to help out. When those cars, you get home at night, it'll get you through the supper hour. So that's another role that storage is going to play, is the electric batteries. And the car owner already bought the battery, so it's not, you don't have to really talk about the cost of the battery. They'll get some payment for making it available to the grid, so that's going to be part of it. And also, no introduction to the Ontario electricity situation would be complete without mentioning the potential role of greater interconnection with Quebec. And that's a complicated topic, but they store power in Quebec for years. They manage those big watersheds over periods of years, never mind weeks or months. And so if Ontario can build stronger interconnections with Quebec, I can't even start to go into all of the issues, political and economic issues that come into play, but there's a certain logic to stronger connections with Quebec so that we could access not only their electricity, but also their long-term storage capacity behind their dams.
Maybe another question?
Thank you.
And before any other people arrive or ask more questions, I would say you alluded to interim goals. So I talked 2050 as big picture, but obviously we need much more rigor in near-term goals as well, 2030, 2035. And again, that's the province stepping up to the plate and working with the federal government. So that's a barrier at the moment to getting clarity on what the step changes are to get where we need to go. And Ralph, it's good he mentioned EVs connected to the grid because lots of people do see that as one of the major sources of storage. But again, we need policies and we need regulations. We're putting out potentially millions of vehicles right now that don't necessarily have vehicle-to-grid technical capability. And maybe that should be a standard that by 2030 or 20-something, every car has to have a vehicle-to-grid capacity. The ISO, is key in working to make that kind of thing a reality. In their projections, they do not assume any electric vehicle to grid supply. So that alters the solutions when you include that. Yes, another question.
I don't know if I'm asking a rather outlandish question, but it's been bothering me for a while. Right? I know that for climate transition, the most central issue is making economic sense at provincial level, at individual level, whatever. Why is it difficult for individuals like myself, like most of us, the only thing we have is our nest egg and begin to park for years? Is it difficult to make our investments in non-fossil fuel things now? I don't know, I'd like to be educated if it's possible to make financial sense and make those sensible investments that are not fossil fuel based investments. So there's anything.
Well, I can speak to what I know personally, and that is I track and I invest in companies that are building wind turbines, building advanced grid technology, building photovoltaics, building batteries. I feel like if my capital is going to be deployed to do something that in those individual, and there are ETFs that are clean energy ETFs that have a selection of companies that do that. But I know the next gentleman behind you, Graham Findlay, is going to bring it up if I don't, and that is there are solar co-ops and various energy co-ops across the province that have bonds that you can invest in. And I'm sure Graham can speak to the rates. I know right now the Toronto Renewable Energy Co-op has bonds you can invest in. So there are a number of possibilities. The bonds are certainly quite secure. Is a solar co-op as secure as the Government of Canada bond? Probably, that's maybe arguable, but I haven't heard of any failing yet. So there are ways to do this if you want to, and if you don't want to be invested in individual companies, then some of the ETFs are possibly a way to go, as well as mutual funds. But I'm not an investment advisor, and none of the investment advice I've just given should be taken as of whatever they say at the bottom of their line. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, I was just alluding to the fact that the fossil fuel investments are way more aggressive in selling. So how do we make spread the word across that these kinds of green investments are equally competitive? I think that's another level of communication and public awareness.
Yeah, well, whenever I look at the dividends being paid by companies in Canada, the fossil fuel companies are, of course, way up there on the dividends. I think that the solution is to have policies that create renewable energies and to have a cost to using fossil fuels. We really don't pay for the damage that fossil fuels are doing. The carbon tax doesn't come close to it. If we put on the true cost of using fossil fuels in every dimension, then we would be paying a lot more. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of pushback to doing that. But as I see our society very much in a balance point of the impetus that climate change disasters are driving is not enough yet to tip the balance towards going away from fossil fuels in a faster way. But I also feel like that balance is going to very soon shift. I'll let Graham ask a question.
Thanks, Nate. I would go on person in life for now. So we're all getting up and having some an option or ability to do something else right now. But I have a little bit of information on that to your presentation. Then it has to do with politicization of the IUSO. And Steve made reference to the March 11 document that came out. And it's an annual event that the IESO produces a market perspective of what to expect. In the last 6 or 7 years, they've kind of slightly ignoring the idea that there's electrification transformation happening. In 2023, they didn't produce the report. So the last one we had was January 2023. And in both the most recent one and in 2022, in their market outlook, they forecast what will be the future of existing assets, and in particular, the future of wind and solar assets, which are on your contracts now. So wind and solar assets became contracted from 2004, 2005, with contracts ending in 2025, 26, rate terms in the mid-30s. In the IESO's perspective, all of those assets are not recontracted. They die, we go down to nothing. And we all know that hydroelectric facilities are 100 years old. They only get recontracted to rebuilt every 25 years. Nuclear power stations at 40 years, they get rebuilt and they extend them on. So the same reality exists for wind and solar, but the IESO is not allowed to show a scenario where they could be contract, which I just wanted to point out to you how that organization, their mandate is to pretend as if it's not rational to renew those feed-in-tariff contracts, which we could do at half the price, because the owners of those contracts would gladly take a half-price contracts over hills for other 2 years because the machinery is going to want them on. So it's logical to do it, and it actually affects our pocketbook because it saves us energy. But the masters of our grid right now are not allowed, or at least master planners of our grids are not allowed to say it. Anyway, I just wanted to bring out that that's how political this whole issue with this whole industry is with respect to electric. So to come back to the last slide, Stephen, what can you do? Talk to your politicians. Yes. Alien.
Great advice from a very experienced guy. Thank you.